Well, I want to welcome you to worship online with us again here at Rusagonis Church. We're always glad to have people connect with us in this way, and I want to also extend an open invitation to come sometime for an in-person service. It takes place every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. and we'd be glad to have you here. And as we're kind of getting closer to Christmas now, or at least we can see it coming kind of just around the corner, right? Like one date in particular to mark on your calendar because you won't want to miss it is our children's Christmas musical Sunday. December the 10th at our regular worship time, or again on Tuesday, December 12th at 6:30 in the evening. Like the girls and boys have been getting ready for it all fall, and it's always a highlight for us here at our church. This year it's called It All Happened in the Country, and so we want to fill the building for both performances. We hope to see you as one of the people that are here. Well, as we look into God's Word here today, we're now in week 5 of a 6-part series of messages that we've been calling Bad Ideas, based on some of the stories in the Bible, and for our purposes, really the Old Testament in particular, where people that God loved and he wanted to use to accomplish his good purposes had a bad idea that led to a bad decision, resulting in a bad or an unfavorable outcome, at least until God would step back in and bring it all back in line with his will again. And in terms of bad ideas in the Bible, what we've said before is like we've got lots to choose from. And so we've just selected a few for our series this time, which means we may come back and do a part 2 another time. But we've looked at a number of stories. We looked at the story of Adam and Eve, who had kind of the first big bad idea way back in the book of Genesis in the Garden of Eden. And then we went to the story next of the reluctant prophet Jonah, and some of you will remember his story with the great storm and the great fish and all of the things that went with it. And then it was Naaman from the books of the Kings who needed a healing, but he was too proud to do what was necessary for it, so that was his bad idea. And then last week, Amy talked to us about Aaron and the Israelites and the golden calf that they made in Exodus 32. And if you want to go back and fill in the parts of the series that you weren't here for or that you missed in some way, they're all on our YouTube channel still. Just go back and start at October 22nd, and we'll go from there. But there's something to learn, though, about bad ideas from each and all of them. And as we continue in our series here again today, for the bad idea I want us to look at this time around, we're going to be going to chapter 13 of the Old Testament book of Numbers during one of the most critical moments in Israel's entire history. And I want to set this up for you, because what you have to understand is that in terms of the roller coaster of history that the nation of Israel had, with all the ups and downs they've been through, like they'd gotten at this point about as low as they could go. You know, the craziest roller coaster I've ever been on personally is one in Busch Gardens in Tampa. It's called Shikra, and it starts out with a steady climb up 200 feet in the air. It's just like click, 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 before sending you over a vertical drop at over 100 kilometers an hour. Like it's crazy. You feel like you're going to break through the surface of the ground and keep on going. Well, that's probably where the Israelites would have described themselves at this point. Like whatever they felt like was the lowest they could go, they'd gone lower. They were below the bottom. And the reason is literally as a nation, they'd been slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years. Longer than anybody had memory of. Like any pre-slavery stories they'd heard might as well have been fiction to them. It was so far back. And you might remember the story of how that finally quite dramatically came to an end. Like God sends the old man Moses into Egypt, remember? And he's going in saying, let my people go. And there's some resistance and there's a spiritual intervention. And eventually they make it to the Red Sea with kind of a slow speed chase there where this miraculous crossing takes place. And after that, it's like, I'm sure that there's complete elation for a little while. The way the Bible describes it, it's like they're just kind of spontaneously breaking into songs and dancing. But after a few days pass, it's not long before the adrenaline subsides a little and there's a new realization that starts to settle on them. You know, now they're in the desert. They don't have any shelter. They don't have any real source of food or water. Like they're disorganized. They don't have survival skills. They still have families to worry about. The babies are crying. The elderly are hurting. There are dangers known and unknown to them all around them. And it's hard. Like it's hard for people who've never been responsible for themselves in this way before to suddenly have to be responsible. And it's hard for Moses too, who's trying to lead them and to keep their spirits up and, keep them focused on the plan, which, because there was a plan, was to make the gradual journey to this place, this piece of land that he was describing to them as a land flowing with milk and honey, which sounds good even when you don't know what it means, right? But what he was saying was that it would be the perfect place to pasture cattle that would give them milk, among other things, and grow crops that would bring the bees to give them honey, among other things. And really, it was just a symbol for what it meant to be the first generation in a long time where they'd have a place to go to bed at night and get up in the morning and have it feel like they were really home. And so if you can get a picture of what that might feel like, that was what was pushing them forward as a nation. It was the only thing. And eventually they do make it to the borderland. Like, they are right on the cusp of what God had promised them. And they're getting ready to send in a reconnaissance team to scout it all out ahead of time for them. And this is the story from Numbers 13. I'm going to read just bits and pieces of it for you, but we'll work our way through it. In verse 1 it says this: "The Lord now said to Moses, 'Send out men to explore the land of Canaan, the land I'm giving to the Israelites. Send one leader from each of the 12 ancestral tribes.' And so Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He sent out 12 men, all tribal leaders of Israel, which is important to know because it meant that they were people who were trusted. He sent them out from the camp in the wilderness of Paran. And he even lists the names for us, which I'll just kind of skip over now, but they're all recorded for us there if you want to look them up. And then in verse 17, they kind of get their marching orders. Moses gave the men these instructions as he sent them out to explore the land. He says, 'Go north through the Negev into the hill country.' And really pay attention to a couple of things while you're there. See what the land is like and find out whether the people living there are strong or weak, few or many. See what kind of land they live in. Is it good or bad? Do their towns have walls, or are they unprotected like open camps? Is the soil fertile or is it poor? Are there many trees? And what would be really great if you can pull it off for us is do your best to bring back samples of the crops you see. And it says, the Bible says, it happened to be the season for harvesting the first ripe grapes. So it was great timing. But bring us back a taste of it, like a taste of what we're in for. And then that's it. That's the assignment. He goes back and forth on it a bit, talking about it, but he basically is getting them to scout out two things. Like, first of all, check out the quality of the land and what it's able to produce. Not because they really need to know it. I mean, God already said that it was flowing with things, right? But nothing motivates like firsthand knowledge. So bring us back a taste even, so we'll be hungry for it. And then secondly, check out the people who are living there now who God is going to give us victory over in order for us to move in. Check out the land, check out the people, just whet our appetite for what's in store. And so they do. These 12 tribal leaders, they do the job. This is verse 21. So they went up and they explored the land. And by the way, they explored all of it. It took them 40 days to do it. And when they came to the valley of Eshcol, they actually even remembered the best part. They cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes so large, it says that it took 2 of them to carry it on a pole between them. And they also brought back samples of other things, pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol, which means cluster, because of the cluster of grapes the Israelite men cut there. And by the way, that part of Israel is still known for its grape harvest. Apparently, it's not unusual to have clusters that are like 20 pounds or more. And so if you can imagine this, when they arrived back at base camp again, after those 40 days were up, they came to give their report to Moses, but everybody shows up for it. Everybody wants to hear what they found. And verse 27 says, this was their report to Moses. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it is indeed a bountiful country. A land flowing with milk and honey. Here's the kind of fruit it produces, right? They had it with them. Everything we were told about it is true, which so far so good, right? No bad ideas yet. The report on the land, solid. But, they said, but. The people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak, who were legendary warriors. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live down along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan Valley. And as they're talking, like you can kind of imagine it, right? Like it's like somebody brought a bucket of ice water to a campfire. All that early enthusiasm starts to temper a little bit because remember, these were people who were discouraged already. They weren't people who were very well equipped. They hadn't made a decision of their own for their entire lives. They didn't have any weapons or resources. They didn't have any strategy. The only real strategy they had was to just go and live in the land that God was supposed to be giving them. And in their minds, that didn't include displacing all of these well-resourced, well-fortified people who were already there. Like we're getting to see a bit of the anatomy of a bad idea here. We're going to see how it gets formed. And one of the 12 spies, a man named Caleb, he sees it forming up too. And so like he jumps in and he tries to turn it back around again. He tries to relight the fire. It says, but Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. Let's go at once and take the land, he said. We can certainly conquer it. Because remember, it's exactly as it was described for us. And that's all we need to know. God's going to give it to us. Let's go. Let's do it. But the other men who had explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go up against them. Like, they're stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw there were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. And that's what they thought too. Like they could actually know what other people were thinking. But it didn't matter because it was already gone. And I want to flesh that out for a few minutes here before we're through, because I think there are things to be learned there. But the big takeaway that we try to get from this story, because we've tried to identify one in each message in our series, is this. The big takeaway is it's always a bad idea to live by sight and not by faith. Like Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5 that we are to live by faith and not by sight, or live by believing and not by seeing. But what they were doing was the opposite. They were living by seeing and not by believing. Because as good as the 12 spies were about bringing back the information they were asked to bring back, they got confused about one little detail, or the vast majority of them did. A couple of the men got it right, but their voices get lost in the noise of the rest. But what the group got confused about was this. They were asked to report on what the scope of the land looked like, not whether or not they could actually occupy it. And it didn't work out well for them. It is always a bad idea to live by sight and not by faith. And as you let that settle, there are three things that I want to just mention before we're through that living by sight and not by faith actually does to a person. Because we've all been guilty of it, haven't we? In fact, we probably don't know how many times we have actually allowed the obstacles we see to keep us from experiencing God's provision by faith. And this can happen to people, and it can happen to churches. It can happen to groups of Christians. Three things I want to mention that living by sight and not by faith in God to provide does. First thing is this. It initiates what I want to call middle ground distress. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Back a few years ago, Wendy and I and a few other friends had been out enjoying the Fundy Trail just outside of St. Martin's. It's one of the places we like to go. And we'd stopped at Big Salmon River, which is a beautiful little historic valley nestled in between some of the ledges that are there, which was quite a big logging operation that happened there a long time ago. And if you've ever been there, you'll likely remember that they have a suspended bridge that you can walk across in order to get to the other side of the river. It's just a suspension bridge. It hangs between two ends. And it's not an especially long bridge and not very far at all above the ground. But when we were going across on this particular day, there was a woman ahead of us as part of another group who was She was walking so carefully and holding on to both sides as tightly as she could with every step. And Wendy will tell you, sometimes she says to me that, I can smell fear. And I mean, something told me the woman would be a good sport about it, even if it frightened her a little. So every time she went to take a step, I was behind her. I'd grab both sides of the bridge and make it swing back and forth as much as I could. And when I did, she'd scream and she'd freeze in place. And when it settled again and stopped moving, she'd look behind her to see what was going on. And I'd do the same thing. I'd be looking behind me too, saying, like, I can't believe somebody would do that. Like, cut that out back there. And then she'd turn around and get her nerve up and take another step, and I'd swing it again. Now, eventually the joke is over, right? And there was, it was getting to be a lineup behind us too, so I let her get across. But for a period of time, I'm sure that for reasons that she would have said were clearly outside of her control, she was dealing with a kind of middle ground distress, where she'd already launched from the familiarity of where she started, but she didn't seem to be able to do what needed to be done, to take the steps she needed to take to get to the place where she wanted to go. And that's a pretty uncertain place to be, right? I mean, even figuratively, like for the Israelite people, they'd done some hard things already and were clearly headed in the direction they needed to go. They were excited about it. They saw the grapes. They saw the fruit of the land. But then these 12 leaders, people they trusted, started talking about what was ahead of them and painting a picture that they weren't prepared for. And all of a sudden, it's like they're out there in the middle of the suspension bridge, holding on for dear life and genuinely distressed about where to go from there. And I don't want to say anything more about that other than to acknowledge it, because it's a fearful place to be in terms of our relationship with God. Not quite disbelieving, but not having the confidence and the trust and the faith to press on. And it can lead quite easily to a second thing that living by sight and not by faith does to a person sometimes. And it's this. It causes people, sometimes illogically even, to idealize the past. And this is hard to understand really, but it happens. It's actually amazing how the human brain works and how we can block out large pieces of our experience, all for the sake of wanting to return to what we have known. Just listen to what the Israelite people said after the spies started telling them about how big and strong the people were living in the land of Canaan. And understanding they were right on the doorstep, right? But this is from the opening verses of Numbers 14 now. It says, "Then the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night." Like, that's the middle ground distress I was talking about. That's right where they are. And then their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. "If only we died in Egypt, or even here in the wilderness," they complained. "Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt?" And then it says they plotted among themselves, "Let's choose a new leader and go back to Egypt." Back to Egypt, like back to the place where they had absolutely no personal agency, where people told them when to get up, when to go to bed, where they worked long, hard hours and were literally whipped like animals when they stopped to stretch, for a moment. Like, what's going on? It's hard to imagine when you read it, but maybe not so hard when you think about it. Because don't we do that too sometimes? I remember one time when a man who was quite new to the whole idea of Christian faith and how God intervenes in our lives, how he came to me one time and he was telling me all the ways that God was working in his life. And he was excited about it in his relationships, his work life. He had a custody case that was going on. He thought it was going his way. He was giving credit to God for that. And I remember saying to him, "That's great, but how are you going to feel when it's not all going your way? How are you going to feel then?" Because faith is easy when all the answers to our prayers are yes. But when we run into something that we aren't expecting, or there's something in front of us that looks like it's going to be impossible to deal with, that's when faith gets real. But if we're operating on a level of sight and not faith, even though where we came from might not be ideal, we idealize it anyway, and we will often retreat from God and fall back into relationships and habits and patterns of life that we knew before. Living by sight, not by faith, causes people to idealize the past. And then the last one I want to mention is this. I think it's important to acknowledge, because of the way it impacts the entire community around us, is that it deliberately tries to quiet the hope of others. And in Israel, this took an extreme form, because remember when I said that the majority of the spies drowned out the voices of the few that were kind of in a differing opinion? Well, the minority were just two men, really, Caleb and Joshua. And they tried their hardest to get their people to look beyond the obstacles and step forward in faith, even despite what they'd seen and what they were saying. So the two of them were saying, but it's so good. And we're so close. The land is exactly what we were told it's going to be like. If anything, it's even better. And yes, the people who live there are big and strong, but we've got God on our side. He's going to come through. He always does. Remember the Red Sea? Literally, they said, do not rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land. But then we read this in verse 10. It says, but the whole community began to talk about stoning Joshua and Caleb. I mean, why? These were respected leaders at that time. 2 of the 12 that were chosen to go on the recon mission. It seems a little extreme, doesn't it? But when we live by sight and not by faith, there's something that happens inside a person where if I don't have faith to move forward, I don't want the guilt trip from anyone who does. Living by sight and not by faith deliberately tries to quiet the hope of others. And friends, this is a very old story from a very different place and time, but isn't there a word here for our church and any church in our own day and age, for the church? It's not a secret anymore that we're living in a challenging time to be a follower of Jesus, and there are more obstacles in front of us in terms of being obedient to God and stepping into his calling than many of us are able to remember. And the question is, what might God be calling us to do that we have been reluctant to accept simply because we are able to see the barriers, and despite the fact that there's milk and honey on the other side? If you know the Israelite story, you probably know it was a bad idea for them to live by sight and not by faith in this circumstance, because they would indeed occupy the land God had promised them, but not during that generation. And they would end up wandering as a people for 40 years until another generation of God's people would rise up and maybe have faith to do what their parents couldn't or wouldn't do before them. Friends, let's not wait a generation to receive the promises of God. Let's be courageous. Let's take bold steps. And may we see God at work in our lives and the world that we're living in for the sake of his kingdom. Let's pray for a few moments together. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this story from your word, and thank you for the lessons it has to teach us as your people in a very different world and typically under very different circumstances. Lord, help us to actually live by faith, and forgive us for the times when we live only by sight. Give us the courage to believe in you for the incredible and to see the incredible happening in the world that we live in this generation. And we make that prayer with all of our prayers today in the name of our Savior Jesus and for his sake. Amen.